Hi, this is Paul, and this is Rough Draft for Sunday, where I run through the current version of my Sunday sermon. Jesus is apocalyptic. Now, this word isn't uncommon in today's language. The Kansas State House, with its grand mural of John Brown at the center of the Civil War, outstretched arms, Bible in one hand, gun in the other, skies parted, him larger than life, expression on his face, apocalyptic. Now, quite recently, a movie, Jesus Revolution, has come onto the scene, and it's made quite a few waves. A lot of church people have seen it. People are excited about it, and some of us are old enough to remember the time that that movie was made. I myself was pretty young or the time that the movie kind of points to. I was pretty young in 1968, old enough to remember things, but I much more clearly remember the 70s than the 60s. There's still a lot of nostalgia around the so-called Summer of Love in Haight-Ashbury and San Francisco. A lot of people sort of get warm feelings about it. A little bit of reading of history sort of takes the bloom off the rose. The Jesus movement really started in San Francisco, and eventually Lonnie Frisbee moved down to Southern California, where he was from. And there are a number of good books around that can sort of help orient and remind. God's Forever Family, published in 2013, sort of a good comprehensive history of it. Some 50 years later, I picked up this other book at the behest of my friend Bern Power, and could get it used. Was written in 1972, published by Erdman's. And part of what's fun about reading a book from 1972 versus reading a book from 2013 is, boy, when you read a book from 1972, if you remember 1972, you can just sort of taste the time in the reading of the book and the pictures of the book. It's all just sort of right there. The bloom came off the rose very quickly in the Summer of Love. So some people would say, yeah, don't just bring flowers in your hair. You better bring a sleeping bag and a sandwich if you want to actually survive, because the nuts and bolts of surviving is much different from the imagined realities of love and acceptance and all that groovy stuff. One person back in the day quipped, the flower movement was like a valley of thousands of plump white rabbits surrounded by wounded coyotes. Drugs, sex, rock and roll, trauma, sexual violence, wounds, and eventually neglected kids and broken relationships. The Summer of Love only lasted a summer because about after that, everybody recognized this thing is not necessarily such a good idea. And it's in fact from that chaos that a lot of what emerged came. The guy in the picture of the magazine here, Christian Life, is named Ted Wise, and he was an early leader in this movement. He had moved to the Bay Area. He had been in the Navy, so he had learned to use sailcloth, and he was working for people who had boats there in the Bay Area, and he was able to score drugs of various sorts, and he was sleeping around, but at the same time he was married and he had children. And his wife, who was also doing some of the drugs, and sort of, they married in the midst of all of that flowering, began to be increasingly frustrated with her husband and didn't know where it would go, and so then stumbled into a Baptist church. And here's a picture of the pastor and his family about at the time of that Baptist church. They were, of course, very square. And really, the Jesus movement comes out of sort of the combustible mix between the chaos of the hippies and the drugs and the order of the squares. And I haven't seen the movie Jesus Revolution yet, but from what I've read, that combination and making that work is sort of what all of this comes out of. Early converts like Ted Wise turned to Jesus because the drugs, the sex, the realization of the lifestyle they thought they wanted wasn't stable and didn't produce the expected flourishing. If you have any conscience at all, if you watch your wife and your children suffer, Something's going to have to give. And what's it going to be? How can you find the new life forward? In hippie rescue coffee shops, homes, storefronts, the work of constructing a life after the deconstruction of post-World War II conformity was really hammered out. And those of us who remember the 70s remember that elements of the counterculture sort of infused the overall culture, and we've actually been working on a lot of those realities ever since. One of the things that's tremendously important to remember about that moment was it was a deeply apocalyptic age. As these authors note, another characteristic is their strong apocalyptic belief that they are living in the last days and that they are the last youth generation that will live on the earth. You had the threat of nuclear war. Of course, the Summer of Love in 1967 gave birth to 1968, where there was the Tet Offensive, the continued anxiety and protest about the Vietnam War. What seemed to be so clear in the Cold War, which was stopping communism, suddenly found Americans with blood on their hands, and they weren't at all sure that this really was a war about communism, or was this in fact a Vietnamese civil war that we had blundered into. Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy were both assassinated that year. The Democrats tried to get their act together in the convention. There were huge riots in Chicago. Nixon was elected on a law and order platform. People looked at the world and said, this can't go on much longer. Everything's coming apart at the seams. Some people were saying it must come apart because the old regime is corrupt and staid and can't live. But the hippies, well, they couldn't even last a summer. Can life really go on? Apocalyptic, of course, you can find in the Bible. Read Jesus in Matthew 24. Jesus left the temple and was walking away when his disciples came up to him to call his attention to its buildings. Look at this amazing temple that Herod has reconstructed, these enormous stones, the beauty of the temple. Do you see these things? Jesus asked. Truly, I tell you, not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down. Of course, Jesus is talking in the 30s, and it will be in the 60s that the Romans will come and level this place. As Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. Tell us, they said, when will this happen? And what will be the signs of your coming and of the end of the age? Jesus answered, watch out that no one deceives you. For many will come in my name, claiming, I am the Messiah, and will deceive many. You will hear of wars and rumors of wars. But see to it that you are not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. These are all the beginnings of the birth pains. Now, people have been reading this for 2,000 years, and they've seen earthquakes and famines and wars and rumors of wars and kingdoms rising against kingdoms. So if any of you tells you, there he is out in the wilderness, do not go out. Or here he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as lightning that comes from the east is visible even in the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever there is a carcass, there the vultures will gather. It'll be obvious. Immediately after the distress of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky, and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. Apocalypse, an end of the current order, everything in distress. It's coming. There will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then all the peoples of the earth will mourn when they see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. It's quite a contrast. Isn't that exactly what John the Baptist was hoping? Jesus would come the first time. Isn't this exactly what people were anticipating? In fact, wasn't this even sort of what the devil asked him to do at the beginning of his ministry? And he will send his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the heavens to the other. Now learn this lesson from the fig tree. As soon as the figs get tender and its leaves come out, you know that summer is near. Even so, when you see all these things, you know that it is near, right at the door. Truly I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. His words are still here. Heaven and earth are still here. What are we to think about this? Christians have been reading this and looking into the sky and expecting and anticipating, and like the hippies looking around and saying, this can't go on much longer. Therefore keep watch, because you do not know on what day your Lord will come. But understand this, if the owner of the house had known at what time of night the thief was coming, he would have kept watch and would have not let his house be broken into. So you must be ready, because the Son of Man will come at an hour when you do not expect him. Well, what does that readiness mean? He doesn't mean it physically, that we somehow have to try to stay awake. Christians, of course, would never sleep, and people can't live that way. It's clearly a parable. Who then is the wise and faithful servant whom the master has put in charge of the servants in his household to give them their food at the proper time? It will be good for that servant whose master finds him doing so when he returns. Truly I tell you, he will put him in charge of all of his possessions. But suppose that servant is wicked and says to himself, my master is staying away a long time. And he then begins to beat his fellow servants and to eat and drink with drunkards. The master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour he's not aware of. He will cut him to pieces and assign him a place with the hypocrites, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Here it is again. We saw it last week. Jesus with these warnings of outer darkness, of shut doors, of weeping, of gnashing of teeth. You don't want to be that guy who says, he's away a long time, I'll take advantage. I'll move into the master suite. I'll treat all of his servants as if I'm not a fellow servant, but I'm their master, and I'll have my way with them, my well-being at their expense. Jesus says, you don't want to be that guy. Now, this has been perennial in Christianity. You can't find a Christian age in which Christians weren't sort of living at the edge of their chair, imagining exactly like the hippies were imagining, this world can't go on much longer. Look at what's happening. Everything's being upended. Young Martin Luther, who is studying to be a lawyer, enters a monastery because of a thunderstorm in the woods. And because everybody in Martin's age knows that the coming of the Son of Man is just around the corner. And what better could he do than take the cowl than enter the monastery? Men believed the end of the world already had been postponed for the sake of the Cistercian monks. Christ had just bidden the angel blow trumpet for the last judgment when the Mother of Mercy fell at the feet of her Son and besought him to spare a while, at least for my friends of the Cistercian order, that they may prepare themselves. The very devils complained of Saint Benedict as a robber who had stolen souls out of their hands. He who died in the cowl would receive preferential treatment in heaven because of his habit. Martin Luther was ready for the coming of the Son of Man and wrapped himself in the monastery, in the cowl, ready. That was, of course, before all of the things that we would know him for would happen. Now, of course, this is nothing new. The most popular book in the most popular nonfiction book in the 1970s, The Late Great Planet Earth by Hal Lindsey. And when Jesus didn't show up, 1980, Countdown to Armageddon. Read those things today, they don't age real well. This sort of breezy dispensational apocalypticism has made Christ's second coming laughable to a lot of new atheists in the 90s. Yeah, look, you said he was coming. Where is he? Again and again, you find this in the 19th century. Continually, Christians are saying, he's coming. And everybody's like, when? Show me. You and your apocalypticism, it undermines your credibility. Memories of Luther or hippies imagining themselves the last generations creates new atheist eye-rolling. See, these stupid Christians will believe all sorts of things. But wait a minute. Apocalyptic seems to be all over the place. One of the most popular things on streaming TV right now is The Last of Us, yet another dystopian future. Imagine the world disrupted by a virus. Who could conceive of such a thing? Aren't pandemics safely in the past? It seems all of our future dreams are dystopian. Young people today say they don't want to have children because who would want to bring a child into this world because of climate change, environmental collapse, war, economic collapse. The humanity has no future. We certainly are the last generation. The environmental apocalypse is just around the corner. The ice caps will melt. The ice sheet falls off of Greenland. The one falls off of, and before you know it, the coasts are inundated and the world will end. Oh, you sort of have apocalypse, don't you? We see this in the developed world's birth rate. It's fallen below replacement levels. It almost seems it's become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Every generation, it seems, faces the fear this can't go on much longer. Your religion may or may not have a holy book, but you have an eschatology. Christian apocalyptics is not merely destruction and judgment, though, and that's where this gets wrong. The apocalypse, but in Christianity, the apocalypse is always dual. It's destruction and it's revelation of the truth. You see, Jesus just can't seem to stay in the grave. People come stumbling out of dead ends with the faith to go forward and the belief that they proceed in hope. Christian apocalypse is always a realized apocalypse. It seems Jesus is not just threatening to break into the whole show, but threatening to break in and continues to break into all of our little lives individually. The day of the Lord comes in large and small helpings. Jesus keeps revealing himself anew to generations that have painted themselves in the corner. And this always seems to be something of a shopkeeper apocalypse. I'll explain what I mean. At that time, the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins, who took their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish and 5 were wise. The foolish one took their lamps, but did not take any oil with them. The wise ones, however, took oil in jars along with their lamps. Now, there's a lot of discussion about what are these lamps? Are they torches? Are they lamps? It seems that it might be sort of torches, and you have oil-soaked rags that you wrap around a stick and you light it and it burns quickly. But obviously, when it's burned out, you have to get new rags. And so in other words, if this ceremony is going to work to receive the bridegroom, you've got to have your stuff ready. You can't just show up with one lit, and then when it goes out, it's like, well, what you gonna do? Anybody with any sense knows this. The bridegroom was a long time in coming, and they all became drowsy and fell asleep. Oh, this is very apocalyptic. It's dark. It's night. They're waiting beyond the capacity for our attention. There are both wise and foolish versions. The values here are shopkeeper values. The wise versions prepare for the world. This isn't just, it's happening in Haight-Ashbury. They're having a great music concert. You get on the bus with the clothes on your back and you go out there and you become one of those little plump white bunnies in the midst of wounded coyotes. Jesus says, nope, not my disciples. All of this enthusiasm just running to the end of the world willy-nilly, not you. You see this all over the New Testament, in fact. You would think, given this apocalypticism that Jesus clearly is of a piece of and of a moment of and clearly spawning throughout history, you would imagine that, well, he would just be giving his kingdom to, well, people who are unprepared for anything. In fact, if you look at 1 Timothy, Paul's description of who should be church leaders, here's a trustworthy saying: whoever aspires to be an overseer desires a noble task. Now, the overseer is to be above reproach, faithful to his wife, temperate, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not given to drunkenness, not violent but gentle, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money. He must manage his own family well and see that his children obey him, and he must do so in a manner worthy of full respect. If anyone does not know how to manage his own family, how can he take care of God's church? He must not be a recent convert, or he may become conceited and fall under the same judgment as the devil. He must also have a good reputation with others, so that he might not fall into disgrace and into the devil's trap. Well, these are shopkeeper values. I remember having a men's study, and we're reading this passage. I thought, Jesus doesn't seem to be looking for all of the, crazy people on the fringe. They certainly have their place. He's looking for trustworthy, reliable people who will show up when they say they'll show up. They'll come on time. They'll be trustworthy, and they can keep the shop running. At midnight, the cry went out, "Here's the bridegroom! Come out to meet him!" Then all the virgins woke up, and they trimmed their lamps. They got their lamps ready. The foolish one said to the wise, "Give us some of your oil. We don't have anything." "No," they replied, "there may not be enough for both us and you. Instead, go to those who sell oil and buy some for yourselves." But while they were on the way to buy the oil, the bridegroom arrived. The virgins who were ready went in to the wedding banquet, and the door was shut. Apparently, preparedness, at least of this kind in the parable, can't really be shared. The preparation for the inbreaking of the bridegroom is into the mundane world of slumber. The expected satanic Peter imagination, well, this can't be outsourced. If you want to be ready to receive the end of history Jesus, the everyday apocalypse Jesus, the inconvenient Jesus, well, maybe you should have some oil on hand. You had better have enough oil in your life to light the torch and join him in the wedding banquet. And right away you might say, "Well, Pastor, I listened to last week. Didn't we talk about wedding banquets last week?" Yeah, we certainly did. They come up again and again in these stories of Jesus that tend to pop up here towards the end of his ministry. Who's the king of the wedding banquet? Who's the bridegroom? Who's the bride? Who are the bridesmaids, the attendants? But remember, this thing ended with a shut door. There's misery. You see this pattern again and again and again in Jesus' apocalyptic parables. Later, the others who went out to the shop came back, and they knocked on the door, and they said, "Lord, Lord, open the door for us." But he replied, "Truly, I tell you, I don't know you." That preparedness has something to do with our disposition towards him. Therefore keep watch, because you do not know the day or the hour. Now, some of you will remember other places in the Gospel of Matthew. Many will say to me, "Lord, Lord, did we not heal the sick and raise the dead?" And he says, "Depart from me, I never knew you." The shut door, the outer darkness, exclusion from the banquet, pleading to come in, but it's too late. These are all stock elements of Jesus' apocalyptic stories. Jesus again says, "Keep watch." Now, why would he say this to a generation who would die 2 millennia before you could read this? What does that mean? What are you to keep watch for? Well, the apocalyptic Christ saves in ways we simply don't expect. He allows his blood to be shed when we expect him to shed the blood of his enemies. He demands constant vigilance when we've let our guard down because we expected him sooner. He promotes shopkeeper values when we expect dramatic displays of impulsive enthusiasm designed to gather attention and glory to ourselves. The Jesus People movement only lasted a few years. It really did. But its influence went far, far beyond that sort of moment of flame out. The people who were radicalized and then saved, settled down, got jobs, went to church, raised families. It launched Christian contemporary music. It became the seedbed of the seeker movement, the megachurch movement. You really can't understand American evangelicalism without the Jesus movement, but it was born of it before as well. Realize Shopkeeper Apocalyptic in American Christianity just keeps adding some chaos when the church gets too rigid. And the shopkeeping keeps the chaos from getting too disruptive to ruin faith intergenerational transmission. Is there enough realized apocalyptic in your life? Are you too rigid? Can Jesus not find any space for you because you've just got it all nailed down and it's too buttoned up and in place? That's a very dangerous place to be. Gandalf can come knocking at the door to Bilbo Baggins and say, Bilbo, you're going to be our burglar. And I'm not taking no for an answer. Are you prepared for the inbreaking of the apocalyptic Jesus in your life? The day of the Lord can and will come in unexpected ways. Will you be ready? There won't be any chance to run out to the store and get what you need. You'd better have it with you. Is there enough shopkeeping in your life? Are you the kind that's just always ready? You're just a master of chaos? Are you in the kind of training, disciplined worship, prayer, study, sacrifice that puts oil in your jar to light your lamp when the bridegroom arrives? Are you ready to enter the feast and not to be left on the other side of the door? Are you the kind that's just always making things up at the last minute and has to run to the shop? You don't want to hear the master say, I don't recognize your voice. You never came to me before.